Good morning.
Good morning.
As I was thinking about Darren's communion message, I was thinking about how those men throwing him over, and they're saying to God, forgive us for doing this, don't hold it against us. And what do you think they would have thought when they showed up in Nineveh and he's there? And I don't know why, but it just came to my mind, of their shock, in seeing this man that surely he died, That was a raging sea. Nobody could have survived that. But yet here he is walking and preaching and teaching in Nineveh. Anyway, there's no charge for that one. So, we are in 1 John chapter 5 this morning. Have you ever witnessed or maybe participated in a scene where two siblings are arguing and fighting and at each other's throat, and you just think to yourself they're going to kill each other almost, And then all of a sudden somebody else comes into the scene and they start picking on one of the siblings. And then the sibling sticks up, hey, you can't pick on my brother, my sister. You can't do that. And starts defending them. Have you ever seen something like that?
Yeah.
Maybe participated in it. We don't have to confess that. But can you imagine that feeling of what it would be like to have somebody come to your defense that maybe you were just arguing with a few minutes ago? Maybe you had something going on. This morning we're going to be talking about how we, as children of God, are the benefactors of God's love. And like we've been talking about the last few weeks, God's design for us is to love one another as He has loved us. But as siblings, or as sometimes looking at others or others looking at us, maybe there's some tension in that relationship. Maybe there's some things that cause us some issues. I'd like to read from 1 John chapter 5, the first 5 verses. Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. This is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out His commands. This is love for God, to obey His commands, and His commands are not burdensome. For everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world? Only he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. There's one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament is about Joseph. And those of you that know the story of Joseph, he was the second to the youngest of 12 children. The second to the youngest, but the firstborn to his favorite wife. And so Jacob has this son Joseph. And because it was his favorite wife and the first child, he dotes on this child. He wants this child to have everything, but it causes a problem. There's some jealousy that comes into the story because his brothers weren't so pleased with this pouring out of his love. and they were jealous of him, and so they conspired against him. So he had these visions about how the 11 stalks would bow down to the one stalk, or the sun and the moon and the 11 stars would bow down to this one star, and they're like, oh boy, this guy is really stuck on himself because he thinks we're all going to bow down to him. And so after hearing these prophecies that he had dreamt, and after everything that had gone on with his father giving him this beautiful coat of many colors, and all of these things happen, the brothers conspired against him. He comes out to check on them and tracks them down, finally finds them. When he does, he is thrown into a pit. And when he's in that pit, they're over there talking and trying to figure out what they're going to do with this guy, and one saying, let's just kill him and get rid of him. Another one saying, well, maybe we should just leave him there and just wait and see what happens. And somebody else says, well, if we do that, he might get back to Dad, and then we're all in trouble, so we can't do that. And along comes these gypsies. The gypsies come along. Now, what you don't really see is in the background, there's a few of the brothers that's trying to figure a way out of this, but they don't want to tell the other brothers. So they sneak around and they come back, and they're going to get him out of the well and let him go. And so they get there, and the well's empty. And he's like, what happened? And, well, the brothers saw these gypsies, and they saw this perfect opportunity. Here's a way to get rid of them, and we don't even have to kill them. We'll just give them to the gypsies, and the gypsies will take them, and we'll never see them again. And so they give them to the gypsies, and then the other brothers are like, wait a minute, what happened? We should have done this, guys. We're going to be in big trouble. No problem. We'll just take the coat that we stole off of him, and we'll tear it and rip it apart, and then we'll sprinkle blood on it, and we'll take it back to Dad and show him that he's dead. And he is dead to us. He's no longer a problem for us. So they do this, and the dad goes in mourning, and he mourns for his son that he's lost. And I am sure that those brothers were unconcerned at first, but then they become more and more concerned when they realize what they've done. But how do you back out of this one? Well, fast forward many years, there's a famine, there's no food, they are starving, and they finally say, let's go to Egypt. We've heard rumors that there's somebody down there that's food. What they don't know is that Joseph was carried down to Egypt by the gypsies and sold into slavery down there. As a slave, he was accused of misdoing, even though he had served his master so well that his master had put him up to the highest ranking. When he would go out of town, he was the one that was in charge of everything that his master owned. And yet he was accused of something falsely and thrown in prison. So in prison, he's the low man on the totem pole now, because the owner of him was the chief of all of the warriors. He was the one that led the armies. And so he's pretty low on the totem pole in prison. But again, he works his way up to the point where everyone looks towards him. When the jailer leaves, he leaves this prisoner in charge of taking care of the place for him. And so now, Joseph is contacted by the king, the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh says to him, I've heard tell that you have a direct link with God. And he says, no, I don't. But God can speak through me. And I can tell you what he said. I didn't say that quite right, but the idea is that the Pharaoh said, tell me about this dream I had. And he tells him the dream. And he tells him a second dream. And he says, what are these dreams? And he says, they're one and the same. There's going to be 7 years of famine, and it's going to get bad. It's going to get really bad. But before that, there's going to be 7 years of good. So if we will lay aside, prepare, then the 7 years of bad won't be so bad. And he was so impressed with him, he says, I'm going to put you in charge of all of that. As a matter of fact, I'm going to put you in charge of everything under me. You'll become the one in charge. So he has them, the whole nation, lay aside the grain, brings it in, and he buys it from everybody. He buys all of the supplies, and he builds warehouses, and he builds bigger warehouses, and he's got it all stored up, and along comes this famine 7 years later, and everything gets bad. And so he begins to sell things back to people. And it ends up that he ends up owning, of course it's under the Pharaoh, but he owns all of the land, all of the homes, all of the belongings, all of the animals, everything belongs to the Pharaoh. Then the foreign lands start coming, and they start coming. Well, among those are his brothers. His brothers show up, and they don't recognize him. They thought he was dead. And so he listens to them, and he pries a little bit, and he figures out a way to get his father and his brothers there. And when they find out that this is their brother, can you imagine the fear that ran through their minds at that time? Can you imagine feeling like, okay, I've had all of this against my brother, and now he's here. And as Joseph is thinking about his brothers that have done all of this to him, the thought must have gone through his mind, here's my chance to get even with them. But instead, he invites them to come down and live there. And he blesses them. And he gives them food, shelter, belongings. And they flourish in this land. And when his father dies, the brother comes to him and says, hey, Dad told us to tell you to go easy on us when he's gone. and Joseph knows that this is their way of begging him for mercy. And he says, don't worry about it. He said, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. And so here we have the very story that we are talking about here in 1 John. Because in 1 John, he starts off and he says, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God. Everyone who believes that Jesus Christ is the Son of God is born of God. We are a descendant of him. That's what he's saying is when we believe. And by the way, this word believe is not an intellectual belief. This word brings about a response. This word belief or faith has a response that is attached to it. It's just not an intellectual belief like the demons believed and shuddered. It was a belief that has a response with it, to follow, to do his commands, to do what God asked him to do. And so he says, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God. We are his descendants. And he goes on, and everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. Now, if this had been true with Joseph's brother, none of that would have happened. Nothing would have sent him to a foreign land. But like he said, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. God used it, even though that was not his desire for his brothers to hate him, to hurt him, to bring evil against him. But he used that for his good, for his will. So when we believe in him, it's not just an intellectual belief, it's a follow-through belief. It's one that has something attached to it. And that attachment is if you truly believe something, you're going to act on it. You're going to follow through. And as a child of God, knowing and understanding that we are the child of the King, that we are the benefactors of the inheritance of the King. And he says, that's you. You are his child. And you have borne his child. Not born in the natural sense, but in an unnatural sense, in that we are born through Jesus. And he says, everyone that loves the Father loves his child as well. Have you ever had a situation where maybe your child was acting up or something and you're kind of mad at him or a little bit frustrated with him, and then somebody else comes along and says something about your kid, and all of a sudden you become the mother bear, or the father bear, It's like, don't you say that about my kid. Just a minute ago you were ready to thrash him, but now that's my kid. I'm defending that child. And I see that God's love for us is so great, and he loves us so much. And he's saying, I want everyone to love you. I want others to love you. And I want you to love each other. Care about one another. In verse 2 of 1 John chapter 5, he says, this is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commands. So, again, he's telling us the same thing. He wants us to love one another. And carrying out his commands, doing his will, is how we love one another. His desire for us is to love others as we love ourselves. He tells us to love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love our neighbors as ourselves. That's his command. That's what he wants us to do. He wants us to love one another. And that love, again, is not an empty love. It's not just words. It's just not saying, I love you. It's actually life-changing. When we love someone, we care about them, when we want what's best for them, we make sacrifices like we talked about last week. That sacrificial love that as believers we have for one another. to be willing to lay down our lives for our brother. There is no greater love than that. And Jesus did that for us, and we should do that for one another. That sacrificial love that he desires for us. In verse 3, he says, in fact, this is love for God, to keep his commands. He repeats it again. And his commands are not burdensome. Have you ever thought about that? Commands, laws, regulations that are burdensome. When you go back to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they had a lot of rules and regulations, to the point where I hear people talk about that if you were walking on a Sabbath day, where you were not allowed to carry a burden or walk more than a certain distance, but if a twig got caught on the hem of your garment, you were breaking the law because you're carrying something on the Sabbath. Now, can you imagine that kind of restriction, that kind of overpowering burden on us to make sure that we did everything? And that was just one of, I think somebody said, over 3,000 laws that the Pharisees and the Sadducees had. But to think that all of that, how burdensome that would be, how hard it would be to think all the time, am I doing the right thing? Am I breaking the law? Do you know what? That sometimes happens in the church. Sometimes we do that, not realizing that we're laying burdens on people and causing them to carry something. But that's not God's desires. His burden is light. In Matthew chapter 23 and verse 4, it says, they tie up heavy cumbersome loads, speaking of the Pharisees and Sadducees, and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. So the burden was laid on them, and they're not even there to help them. They're not even there to assist them. In Luke chapter 11 and verse 46, he says, and Jesus replied, and you experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens that they can hardly carry, and you yourself will not lift one finger to help them. That's Jesus speaking about these Pharisees and Sadducees that were burdening them down with all of these things. But in Matthew 11 and verse 30, Jesus says, for my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. How could God's commands be light? How could that help us or lighten our load? Well, when you look at what Jesus' command is, his command is to love one another, to care about one another. Now, I want you to think about a family for a minute. If everybody in the family loved one another and cared about one another, sacrificially, willing to give of themselves to help others, if you were in that situation, how heavy would your burden be? If we truly cared about one another, if we loved one another, it's not a burden. It's not a burden at all. As a matter of fact, our burdens are lightened because we're all together. We're all on one page. Or the words that Rhonda uses is, he's for me, not against me. We're a team. We're working together. So, in John chapter 14, verse 15, he says, if you love me, keep my commandments. And in verse 21, whoever has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love them and show myself to them. These examples of this love is not a burden at all, although it calls it a burden, but his burden is light, and that burden is actually one that helps each other and works together to benefit one another. And when we put all of that together, as we see his instructions here, it's actually threefold. The first one he says is that the true Christian, the one that is born of God, believes in the Son of God. Secondly, loves God and the children of God. And then thirdly, keeps his commandments. And some people consider that to be works. You know, that you're trying to earn your salvation. You're trying to win God's favor by doing these things, by making this part of our salvation. But that's not it at all. All of the things that he's given us, all of the commands that he's instructed us, is to help one another, to benefit one another. When we truly love and care for one another, we lighten each other's burdens. Have you ever been working on something and struggling with it and just trying to push through it, and then somebody comes along and says, here, let me help you. And it's like, wow, that's lighter. And then somebody else comes along, man, this is easy. We had a car that had stalled out in front of us, and somebody else was driving, so 3 of us jumped out. And the first one that got there, the guy's like, oh, thank you. And then the second one got there, and there's no room for the third person, so he goes over to the side and starts pushing on the back windshield, you know, kind of from the side. And it's like, man, you could just do it with one finger. We were just walking along. And we were going to push it over to the side of the road, but the guy that got in there, he was like, hey, this is easy. I'm just going to keep going. And he kept going down the road about a quarter mile before we finally got off. It was so easy. It was hardly nothing, you know. And he got a wide place in the road and finally pulled off. I think 3 of us quit pushing about that time. But anyway, the point is that it's not a burden when we work together. Right? It's actually lightens our load. And God's desire is for us to love one another. When we love one another, to the point of being willing to sacrifice, that sacrificial love, our burdens are lightened as well. And that's His desire for us. He wants us to have that relationship. I want to read this one more time through, because now with that little background, I want you to hear what he says. It's 5 short verses. Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God. And everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. This is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out His commands. This is love for God, to obey His commands. And His commands are not burdensome. For everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. Who is this? Who is it that overcomes the world? Only he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. One thing that I forgot to mention is this world, this overpowering, overburdensome world that we live in, that sometimes discourages us, brings us down, gives us heartache and loss. All of the things, that's not of God, that's of Satan, that's of the world around us. Those heartaches, those pressures, those bad things. How do we become victorious over that? How do we overcome the world? It's by His love, by His grace. When we become like Him and begin to care about one another, and when we accept, believe that Jesus Christ is who He claims to be, the Son of God, we have victory already. He's already granted us that. Like I said, that belief is not a vacant intellectual belief, but when we truly believe, we're going to act on that belief. We're going to do something. And what we do is we love one another. We care about one another. And this is the hard part. You're going to think this is the easy part, but it's actually the hardest part. We can accept someone else's love. We can accept someone else's help. If we'd come up behind that car and the guy had said, no, I'm not doing this. This is all me. He could have probably done it, but he would have enjoyed the benefits of accepting the love that others have for him. And the burdens of this world can be overcome by accepting God's love, accepting our brothers and sisters' love, working together, enjoying the benefits of being children of God and children of brothers and sisters to one another, to enjoy those benefits. As we reflect on these things, the question is whether or not we want to lay those burdens down, or do we want to carry them? And that may sound like a crazy question, but when you really think about it, it's a matter of choosing whether we're going to live as the world, to consider the things of this world as more important than God, or we're going to take God at His word and realize that the things of this world are not worth holding on to. The things of this world are not important to us. The things of this world are temporal, that will disappear, that will go away. But the things of His kingdom will never end. That love that we have for one another will never end. It will continue on. And we will enjoy those blessings only in this life, but in the life to come. The song we're about to sing is Burdens Are Lifted at Calvary.